Welcome, everyone. I'm Eileen Hunt-Godding. Our first session is on monstrous and post-human aesthetics and imaginations, inspired by that dreary night in November on which Frankenstein's creature came to life. I'll be chairing the panel. We'll aim to have 30 minutes of discussion with the audience after each presenter speaks for about 20 minutes. I'll introduce them now in the order that they will speak. I'm going to keep it short because these three intellectuals are so famous, they speak for themselves. Joyce Carol Oates is a professor of creative writing at Princeton University, and she'll be speaking on Frankenstein and monstrous imagination. David Archard is a philosopher at Queen's University, Belfast. He'll be speaking on the good, the bad, and the ugly, evil and monstrosity. And Stephen B. Smith is a political philosopher at Yale University, and he'll be speaking on Rousseau, Shelley, and Houellebecq on science and the post-human. And as Augustine noted, feel free to applaud each speaker after they conclude their remarks, but save your questions for after all three presentations are done, and I'll keep the queue, and I'll look forward to hearing your thoughtful remarks on all of these papers. Thank you.
Well, it's very exciting to be reading a paper through this distinguished group. Very, very exciting, and I look forward to our discussion. Since I'm beginning, I have a kind of overview of Frankenstein. Frankenstein and monstrous imagination with quotation marks around the term monstrous imagination. I'm beginning with a little remark from the novel, quote, "My form is a filthy type of yours. A vivid and astonishing sight stands before us. Great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing. His teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, his shriveled countenance and straight black lips. It's as if, or rather it is, the very monstrousness of Victor Frankenstein's creation that has excited abiding interest through the centuries. The creature in itself, apart from its myriad meanings, 8 feet tall and proportionately large, comprised of materials surreptitiously purloined from charnel houses and dissecting rooms, Victor Frankenstein's creature leaps from the pages of a meticulously constructed, heavily elusive and didactic novel of ideas of the early 1800s, a melange of epistolary romance in the mode of Samuel Richardson, moral fable in the mode of Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, Gothic novel in the mode of Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, and poetic theological tract and rejoinder to Milton's Paradise Lost. As a spectacular and sensational sight, a unique phenomenon, both sublime and profane, and possessed of a tragic grandeur as profound as Milton's Satan, this demonic figure surely stands alone in literary history. Only 18 years old when the composition of her first novel was begun, though by this time a precocious student of literature and philosophy, with the interest in science of an eager amateur, Mary Shelley took care to contextualize her luridly sensational work of fiction by framing the body of the novel within letters from an Arctic traveler to his sister that are as thoughtful as any in Samuel Richardson. And parenthetically, when I was writing this, I was thinking from the point of view of being a writer that she was only 18 years old, and to some extent she was creating the form in which she was writing, which is not what people are usually doing. Usually people come to a whole body of work and there's a tradition there, and she's basically creating something. And what she did is instinctively what writers try to do, I think, with obviously fictitious works, or sensational or fantastical works, to sort of contextualize and give a sense that there's a reality there, and you're sort of led into that reality through sentences that are conventionally eloquent sentences. So she's framing the body of the novel, which is something that writers have been doing for centuries, but when she was doing it, it was fairly original and exciting. So in this way, establishing a perspective exterior to fantastic action. In anticipation of the nightmare revelation of chapter 4 of book 1, she provides many passages describing in detail the ambition of a young scientist obsessed with discovering the cause of generation in life. And again, just to say parenthetically, when one first reads the novel, probably we're all fairly young when we read this novel. I was probably 11 or 12, and probably like many people reading it at a young age, you're sort of skimming those passages and getting to the more exciting parts when the creature appears. But this time when I was preparing this paper, I was reading like every sentence, and so thinking, well, she's writing these sentences that are rather beautifully constructed, and why is she doing it? And for me, suddenly the whole gestalt sort of changed, and I was in a way more interested in the context than I was in the actual, the existential appearance of the monster or the creature himself. So she gets us prepared for that chapter 4 of book 1. At that point, I think we're quite ready for it. Indeed, Victor Frankenstein boasts, quote, "Nay, more I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter." So he seems to think that he's able to do this. Though years of effort have gone into the preparation and assemblage of the monster, which Frankenstein intends to be, quote, proportioned and, quote, beautiful, no sooner does the creature's, quote, dull yellow eye open and a convulsive motion agitate its limbs, then horror and disgust fill the scientist's heart and he rushes from the laboratory. Inexplicably, Frankenstein repudiates his creation after a mere glance and soon demonizes it as the, quote, monster, quote, my enemy. From this impulsive and irrevocable act, which might be seen to mirror the criminally irresponsible sexual behavior of several of the men in Mary Godwin's and her half-sister Fanny's lives, that's a real hypothetical. And not from the creation itself, the tragedy of Frankenstein ensues. So again, this is something that my most recent reading of the novel was slightly surprising to me. I probably didn't remember this from the first reading. It's from that irresponsibility of abandonment, not from the ambitious labor of creation itself. That's the primal betrayal. Not from the effort of creating life, but from the unforgivable gesture of repudiation. So I think most people who read the novel think it's the sin is it's a sin against God, or you're creating life. And actually in the novel itself, that wasn't the problem, it was the repudiation. So that was a surprise to me in rereading the novel. By degrees, it will develop that Victor Frankenstein is the stunted figure, the blighted soul unwilling to acknowledge his creation or take responsibility for it. The tormented being whom he calls the monster is the more magnanimous, plied with questions that define him as human. Quote, "My person was hideous and my stature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? When did I come? What was my destination?" Anticipating double-gowned narratives to come, see Poe, Melville, Gogol, Dostoevsky, Stevenson, James, Kafka, Mann, Nabokov, Mary Shelley invests her demonic figure with an impassioned interior life and a purpose. It is through the creature that a transcendent love is expressed, a romantically unrequited love for the unworthy human who has created him. In an unexpected and inspired reversal, it's the monster who becomes both an avenger and a romantic hero in the mode of Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. By the conclusion of the novel, in an Arctic setting put together out of travel books read by Mary Shelley, it is clear that Victor Frankenstein has learned virtually nothing from his experience, for with his dying breath he expresses a wish that another scientist might succeed where he has failed. He persists in imagining himself blameless of any wrongdoing except the original act of creation. His remorse isn't an expression of traditional religious piety, however. He is as unengaged by Christian guilt as the consequences of violating natural law as any daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft might have been. Our last vision of the monster is through Walton's stunned eyes, quote, "As he hung over the coffin, his face was concealed by long locks of ragged hair, but one vast hand was extended in color and apparent texture like that of a mummy. Never did I behold a vision so horrible as his face, of such loathsome yet appalling hideousness." Yet the monster declares, quote, "My heart was refashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture. Like a Shakespearean tragic figure, the monster is a martyr to his own, quote, demonical design. He will prepare his own funeral pile, quote, my ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds." We don't actually witness the monster's death, however. He is only borne away by waves into an uncertain future to survive into succeeding generations and centuries, far beyond the range of even Mary Shelley's fevered imagination. So I think I'll just conclude my paper. I have a little, discuss the monstrous imagination in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's, the very famous, much anthologized The Yellow Wallpaper, and talking about monstrous imagination as the sort of female imagination that's monstrous from the point of view of the patriarchy. And as you all know, everyone's read The Yellow Wallpaper, and probably most of us have taught it a number of times. It has this wonderful ending where the monstrous creature, the female in the wallpaper, is become so conjoined with the narrator, and the male figure, who's actually a doctor, the husband, he is so shocked he faints right across my path by the wall, so I have to creep over him every time. So that's a triumphant ending, at least for the female narrator. As I talk a little bit about, don't have time really, H.P. Lovecraft, who has a number of very interesting stories about reanimation, the whole concept, and the obsession with reanimating dead bodies, which maybe predates Frankenstein the novel, and certainly in successive decades. So if you're interested in regenerating a body, and you really want to go into the details, Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator, it's a cycle of 6 very lurid linked tales in which Lovecraft tracks the obsessive effort of a young scientist to discover the elixir that will reanimate the dead. Herbert West was a medical student, and his story is told by his sidekick, something like Dr. Watson, let's say, to Sherlock Holmes, and this sidekick survives, whereas Herbert West's reanimated bodies come and they tear him limb from limb, and that is the end of Herbert West Reanimated. So the last paragraph, in Lovecraft it isn't justice that is exacted by the reanimated corpses of his laboratory, West's laboratory rising up one night to tear him to pieces. It is simply the inevitable end for a man who pushes too far and defies too much. Catastrophe is a likely ending for the obsessed scientist, allowing his imagination to have free rein, but West's abbreviated story exudes none of the iconic power of Mary Shelley's great tragic novel, which remains a unique achievement in literary history. Thank you.
So thanks very much, and thank you to the organisers, especially I have to say Eileen, with whom I've been corresponding, to take part in this fantastic conference in this splendid location. I should say at the start that a Gothic political culture obtains not just in the United States, and I come from the island of Ireland, and I am British. Whatever successes we might have on the soccer field, we certainly have having those in politics. And I was last week in Berlin to celebrate another anniversary, the 10th anniversary of the German Ethics Council. where actually the ghost of Frankenstein cast a certain shadow over deliberation, since it was about the challenges of modern technology. But it was good to be reminded that I'm a European, and I can reaffirm that here. I'll obey the injunction to be interdisciplinary, though whatever merits I have as a philosopher, you'll quickly realize I'm a very poor literary theorist. This is a very speculative piece of work that's part of two post-retirement projects. One is on the significance of embodiment for moral philosophy, and the other is trying to defend Charles Dickens as a moralist, probably without success. So the basic thought is this: modern English speaking moral philosophy does not associate a morally vicious character with a physically ugly body, yet this is a prominent theme in literature and art. So the monster in Frankenstein is monstrous both in ethical and aesthetic terms, and the interesting question is why. So I'm going to look at two background cultural influences and then four ideas to explore what might underlie that association. So two background influences. Firstly is a classical and Enlightenment belief in the unity of the perfections. So epistemic perfection is truth, aesthetic perfection lies in beauty, and moral perfection lies in virtue or justice. And it's often thought that they conjoin in a rather nice association. So for instance, a truth theory is a beautiful theory, and you get the lovely pulchritude splendor veritatis. Beauty is the splendor of truth. That's actually interesting doing it here in Rome, because you will recognize the Catholic reference. And a just society is often thought to be pleasingly harmonious, and interesting, a good person is beautiful. The other crucial influence is Christian, and I'm quoting here since I'm in Rome, an Italian anatomist. Sorry for the gender non-neutral description. He has a most perfect form which he shares with the angels and the intelligences that rule the universe. And since God created humanity in his image, that is the model of a morally and spiritually good body, whereas any departure from that image, as in the monstrous, is seen as ethically dubious. So there are great ethical explorations in iconography of monsters, deformed beings, and as evil. And just first quote from Frankenstein: nothing in human shape could have destroyed that fair child. So the thought is, to be capable of enormous evil is at the same time to be less than human in physical form. So here are the four ideas I wanted to explore. The first is what I just call the melodramatic mask. Aesthetic properties help to serve as signifiers of moral qualities, both in literature and in art. And there is a long-standing theatrical tradition of melodrama whereby ostension allows inner character to appear through outward appearance, and its most standard form from my childhood. If you wear a white hat, you're good. And if you wear a black hat, you're bad, just for ease of identification. Though in doing the research for this paper, I was fascinated to learn there's a considerable amount of accumulated neuropsychological evidence that actually we do perceive those colours as signifiers. That is, it's much easier for people to recognize virtuous descriptors if they are in white, and easier to recognize ethically dubious descriptors if they're in black. And here I thought I'd introduce you to Dickens, who was a great fan of melodrama. He was himself an actor, he staged plays, and he's often accused of being a crude caricaturist or cartoonist insofar as his characters are melodramatically drawn. So here are three of the more obvious ones. Wackford Squeers, so this is all plot spoilers for those of you who shamefully haven't read this, who's the awful, brutal school teacher, is Nicholas Nickleby, is described as not prepossessing. He had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favour of two. Probably Dickens' worst novel, The Old Curiosity Shop, and one of his worst and most badly drawn evil characters, the dwarf Quilp, who is described early on as grotesque. And then Uriah Heep in David Copperfield, who is described right at this outset as having a cadaverous face and whose mannerisms are ugly. Now, why I introduce you these is then to where Dickens tries to be slightly more subtle. And these are two interesting characters, James Steerforth, from David Copperfield, who is described as reputed to be a great scholar and very good looking. He's handsome, intelligent, witty, yet he is extraordinarily evil. If you know, he's the seducer and abandon of one of the key characters. And then Harold Skimpole from Bleak House, who is a delicate face and a sweet voice, and there was a perfect charm in him, but who also is utterly amoral, selfish, grasping, and treacherous, and who's said to be based, at least in physical appearance, on Dickens' close friend Leigh Hunt. So you have to explain why Leigh Hunt's in it. Now, what you might say is interesting is that Dickens trying to be slightly more naturalistic, less melodramatic, but I think what's interesting is he's trying to get you to see that outward appearance may be deceptive. And you, the reader, see what is wrong with Steerforth and Skimpole. The principal characters don't. Copperfield fails to see what's wrong with Steerforth because he's so charming and so handsome. The second theme I want to explore is a causal expressive one, and that's the thought that what is inside one's moral character is somehow caused by or is expressive of what is outside one's physical appearance. Now, the first half has an influential form, in which I'm going to look at in due course as the third theme. But the second half is perhaps only, or certainly is most plausible, in that it's standard to say that vicious dispositions manifest in ugly bodily manifestations. Standardly, facial, say you get tropes like his face was contorted, distorted by age, rage, hatred, jealousy. So the face shows outwardly these awful emotions, whereas good, morally virtuous disposition emotions manifest in sweet and lovely faces. Yet that only shows that there's a contingent and temporary rather than permanent relationship between inner character and outward. So I'm going to look at what I think is the most interesting theme and most directly relevant to Frankenstein. That's the notion of the good life. And that's a view that goes back to the Greeks, and that is that, and Aristotle is a nice defender of this view, that happiness and virtue are in some sense intertwined. They go together. What is an interesting theme in Frankenstein is the thought that here's a causal version of this. Ugliness causes social rejection, ostracism, isolation, and a loss of self-esteem. That causes unhappiness, and unhappiness disposes you to immorality. So again, some quotes from Frankenstein. I was benevolent and good, misery made me a fiend, make me happy and I shall again be virtuous. I am malicious because I am miserable. My vices are the children of a forced solitude that I abhor. All nice versions of that thesis. The only reason I am bad is because you made me bad in giving me an appearance that caused me to be ostracized and isolated. Rereading it on the way over, it strikes me as slightly more subtle than that, which will nicely tie in with my final comments. Namely, it's the reaction of others to him, which are not simply a reaction to his ugliness, but a belief that his ugliness bespeaks immorality. That is, they cannot believe that he is good, even when he tries to be benevolent, because how could such an ugly creature behave in a morally good way? And that rejection causes him to think so much for benevolence, so much for virtue, wants it by revenge. And this nice quote from Victor: for the first time also I felt what the duties of a creator towards his creatures were, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. In other words, I see, if only for a moment, that his wickedness is a result of the unhappiness that I brought about by creating him in this fashion. Now, I want to suggest that there are a number of ways you can render this good life thesis. So, one of the few pieces by a philosopher, and he's not a moral philosopher like Martin, is a philosopher of mind, English, a nice little article called Felicity and Frankenstein, in a collection of his on the good life and happiness. Here's what he calls the happiness principle. Happiness promotes virtue, unhappiness produces vice. And conversely, he says you might embrace the virtue hypothesis. Cultivating virtue will make you happy. So, if you're happy, you'll be good, and if you're good, you'll be happy. All's well in a perfect world. So let me just try and give you 4 versions of this, or several versions of it, to stimulate discussion. The first is the version you can find, I think, in Frankenstein. Social acceptance, leads to happiness. That produces virtue. Conversely, social ostracism, isolation, rejection, that causes unhappiness, and that generates a vicious character. Secondly, and this is a theme you find in Aristotle, benevolence, being good, is good, both morally and prudentially. It is nice to be good. Makes you feel better. Thirdly, that state of mind, this is Mike Martin's thesis about where Victor goes wrong, that state of mind which disposes to virtue also disposes to happiness, which is given the name tranquility. That is a calm and steady character. Both is a cause of personal happiness, but also of moral rectitude. Troubled, uneasy, disjointed minds are both unhappy psychologically, but also vicious. And fourth, and obviously, a long-standing belief that happiness is the natural consequence of or reward for virtue, and misery is the penalty for vice. It's a thesis that even the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant flirted with, that there must be some congruence between personal happiness and virtue. There must be some point to being good. And the point of being good is you have a good prudential life, not necessarily a good afterlife, but at least on this world you have a good life. The problem for any of those views is how exactly do you then construe moral responsibility? How can you be held blameworthy or to be thought of as good for what you do that is morally right, when it's so obviously associated with rewards, penalties, your life going better or going worse? So that brings me finally to the notion of responsibility, which is an interesting theme, which I'll come back to in Frankenstein. That is a thought that one is morally at fault for physical failings. Thus, outward ugliness bespeaks immorality, insomuch as the former is, in some sense, a personal failing. I should say that my colleague, Heather Widdows, who's a philosopher in the UK, has produced a very nice book on beauty and the demands, particularly on women, to be beautiful. And that it's not just an aesthetic ideal, but a moral ideal, and in some sense you're at fault if you don't strive to be beautiful. But a widely endorsed principle of modern ethics, at least in the English-speaking world, is that individuals can only properly be held responsible, and thus blameworthy, for what they choose, for what is in some sense down to them, what is attributable to them. But ugliness arguably is an unchosen property, even if you think that you might be held responsible for some other failure, namely not minimizing or mitigating or taking care of your ugliness. And yet, this is drawn from the work of John Rawls, without doubt the greatest English-speaking political philosopher of the 20th century. Theory of Justice is his magnum opus. There are lots of bits of it that no one reads. They only tend to read part one. And they leave out an awful lot that's great. And in 2 pages, Rawls throws in this suggestion of natural shame, which is fascinating. He says there are human excellences, and he cites in the text imagination and wit, grace and beauty, that he says are non-exclusive goods, by which he means that these are of value both to their owners and to others, especially in as much as we are social creatures. So essentially there are things we possess, things that are good both for us, but for others insofar as we interact with them. Natural shame, he says, arises from a loss or absence of those goods. He's explicit that this should be understood not as a matter of regret or indeed of guilt, since such a loss is not blameworthy. I should just note here that it's standard in the ethical literature to distinguish between shame and guilt. The thought is that guilt is a peculiarly modern, even Puritan construction, which is a sense inside one of having fallen short or failed, whereas shame is that which you feel before the gaze of others or judgment of others, and is a peculiarly Greek notion, arguably, which has disappeared. shame is feeling bad because of how others judge and see you. Guilt is you feeling bad at what you yourself recognize as having done. So Rawls argues that you might feel shame before the gaze of others in respect of a loss or absence of certain qualities, of which beauty is one. And although he's very careful to say that this shouldn't be seen as a matter of guilt, he says such a loss or absence of these goods is damaging to self-respect and self-esteem, and shame does suggest some kind of failing in the eyes of others. And that brings us, I hope, full circle to the monster. The monster is miserable in the double sense of being wretched, namely extremely unhappy, and contemptible in the sense of morally despicable. Yet if there is any responsibility for that condition, it seems to me in the novel it's properly laid at the hands of his creator, and to that extent he should not be condemned. So please note the passive voice in this passage that Mike Martin draws attention to, and I've italicized all the interesting verbs. This is the monster's complaint to Victor, to a crucial point, when he explains his personal trajectory. My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy. Incidentally, I think, Shelley, there is very much of the standard Enlightenment view that we're tabula rasa at birth, and then it's the ideas and impressions and sensations we got thereafter that make us who we are. And his initial ones are ones of openness to love and benevolence and caring and empathy. So my heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, so caused to be vicious by deep unhappiness, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture, such as you cannot imagine. So the monster complains that he was made a bad person by his circumstances of creation. So in similar terms, it seems to me, one might conclude by arguing that the association of physical and moral monstrosity is a failing not of those who suffer that condition, but of those who construct it in precisely those terms.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to admit, I'm a little bit of an amateur in the world of Frankenstein studies. And so to be here among all of you professional Frankensteinians. But I do have one advantage, or one excuse for being here. I was the dissertation advisor of our panel chair today. So it's a great honor and pleasure to be with Eileen and to be with all of you today. She gave me a very clear brief, the influence of Rousseau on Shelley's Frankenstein. Rousseau is someone that Eileen and I worked on together in her first great book, which should be remembered here, Family Feuds, a book on Burke, Wollstonecraft, and Rousseau. But that Rousseau was read enthusiastically by Mary Shelley's parents, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, and their circle is a matter of record. Wollstonecraft engaged extensively with Rousseau in the vindication of the rights of women, just as Godwin made a point of addressing Rousseau extensively in his inquiry concerning political justice. In 1815, the year before she began work on Frankenstein, Mary Shelley read Rousseau's Confessions, the Émile, and La Nouvelle Heloise. Her novel was conceived on an extended trip to Switzerland, where she, Byron, and her husband Percy read Rousseau while on a boat trip around Lake Geneva. And yet, while the importance of Rousseau for Shelley has been widely attested, there's considerable disagreement over just what it signifies. Paul Cantor, the best reader of the Rousseau-Shelley connection, in my opinion, regards Frankenstein as an imaginative reconstruction of Rousseau's second discourse, the discourse on inequality, which regards the story along Rousseauvian lines in terms of the transition from nature to culture. David Marshall, in The Surprising Effects of Sympathy, developed Cantor's thesis by exploring the psychological theme of sympathy and compassion that he too traces back to Rousseau. And to take one more example, Lawrence Lipkin has found in Rousseau's Emile the key text that informs Frankenstein. But as useful as all these studies are in discovering Rousseauvian themes in Frankenstein, none takes into account the importance of Rousseau's first discourse, the discourse on the sciences and the arts, as helpful in understanding Shelley's book. In the first discourse, Rousseau took aim at what was a cardinal assumption of the Enlightenment, namely the belief that moral and political progress is fundamentally compatible with the free development of the arts and sciences. In this paper, I want to argue that both Rousseau and Shelley saw the dangers inherent in modern science with its Baconian drive to master and conquer nature. Each was concerned with the Promethean aspirations of science to create a new world cleansed of ignorance, misery, superstition, and want. Each foresaw the dangers contained in these aspirations. And the idea of a radical transformation of the human condition, I want to argue, has been most fully developed in a work that should be seen as a sequel to Frankenstein, and I refer to Michel Houellebecq's novel, The Elementary Particles, that I will return to. Frankenstein is an object lesson in the dangers of science gone wrong. Most of the attention has been understandably directed to the creature's autobiography that occupies the second central section of the book, although less time is devoted to the education of Victor, his upbringing in Geneva, his fascination with scientific experimentation, and his increasing isolation from family, society, and friends, even as he works to create what he imagines will be a new and a better species. Victor represents in many ways Shelley's image of the romantic genius alienated from society and banished to its margins. This would clearly fit with Rousseau's own self-image, especially later in life. I am now alone on earth, Rousseau wrote, no longer having brother, friend, or society other than myself. The most loving and sociable of human beings has been banished from society by unanimous agreement, are the first words of the first promenade of the reveries of a solitary walker. Like Victor, Rousseau prided himself. Rousseau prided himself on his scientific curiosity. And yet Rousseau's botanical explorations that reach their peak in his description of his wanderings on the Isle of St. Peter are very different from Victor's frenetic investigations. Rousseau's goal is to return to recapture the original sentiment de soi from the cacophony of the noisy passions that have overlaid it, while Victor's urge to create new life is an expression of his Prometheanism, to move beyond nature and natural limits and attempt to create something never before accomplished. Victor's early life appears to follow the model of the Rousseauvian ideal family sketched in the Nouvelle Heloise. Much like Rousseau, Victor is descended from an ancient Genovese family. His father, Alphonse, was a distinguished public official who late in life married the daughter of a deceased friend named Beaufort, who had fallen into poverty and ruin. Victor was their eldest child. There is soon added a stepsister, Elizabeth, who is the daughter of Victor's aunt, who had passed away in Italy. Victor's fall from this primordial state of grace, you might say, is presaged by his early infatuation with science that he calls the genius that governed his destiny. He describes how he chanced upon a volume of the German occultist Cornelius Agrippa that served as a virtual conversion experience for him. Victor's father is dismissive of his son's newfound passion. He refers to this work as sad trash, but this only serves to incite Victor's curiosity. Victor's studies are so far carried out in a largely autodidactic manner without the benefit of teachers or guides, but he admits that what attracted him to science was the search for the elixir of life. It was not wealth, he says, but glory he hoped to acquire through the banishment of disease and the virtually indefinite prolongation of life. But Victor's infatuation with medieval alchemy is suspended when at the age of 17 he leaves Geneva for college at the University of Ingolstadt. It is only after meeting there Professor Waldman that Victor decides to devote himself to chemistry, setting himself on the path that will become his life's work. We hear him speak in rapturous language about the 2 years he spent devoting himself entirely to the advancement of scientific discovery. The specialization and division of labor imposed by scientific method, he enthuses, has allowed progress not possible in other fields of intellectual endeavor. The branch of chemistry that most caught Victor's fancy is the science of anatomy, and in particular, the causes of corruption and decay. He boasts how his father had trained him to resist superstition and fear of death. A graveyard to him was, he says, simply the receptacle of bodies deprived of life. More and more of his time is spent examining and dissecting corpses to discover the causes of death, and it was from these investigations that he claims to have uncovered the causes of generation and life, and what's more, the art of bestowing animation on lifeless matter. He describes in almost religious terms how he came to the idea of creating a new form of life. I became dizzy with the immensity of its prospect, he recounts. Victor's description of the creature's birth is a testimony to the extraordinary powers contained within modern science. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world, he exclaims, was now within my grasp. Wondering at first whether he should confer the gift of life upon an animal or some other species, he decides to make himself a god and create a human being. The result, he hopes, will be a new species that will bless him as their creator. Many happy and excellent natures will owe their being to me, Victor enthuses in a moment of supreme vanity. Victor's creation of a new species, something unnatural that defies and distorts humanity, is central also to Rousseau's critique of science. Rousseau was deeply aware of the human propensity toward the grotesque. I quote Emile, he turns everything upside down, he disfigures everything, he loves deformity, monsters, Rousseau writes. This propensity is further exacerbated by the claims of modern science to manipulate and control nature, to make it serve human ends. The result is that the small becomes large and the large small. This telescopic, microscopic knowledge distorts the human perspective. Even before Rousseau, Jonathan Swift had suggested these possibilities in his depiction of the kinds of research projects that so amazed Gulliver during his visit to the flying island of Laputa. Shelley is concerned not only with the capacity of science to produce the monstrous, but the effects that this has on the creator himself. She describes Victor as having become secluded and unsocial, cut off from family and friends. More to the point, Victor's life has awakened in him new desires for adulation and fame, to be worshipped like a god. It is not until after the creature has been created, and even later when it demands a mate, that Victor comes to see the error of his ways. His belated awareness about the dangers of knowledge comes only after he's learned the creature has killed his brother William, and then planted damning evidence on the murder on a faithful family servant, Justine Moritz. But the creature's cruelty, we learn, is mitigated in part by the cruelty we just heard in the earlier paper that he has suffered at the hands of others, especially his creator. The creature explains his crime is the result of having been thwarted in his desire for love and his desire for a mate. The creature's act of murder is the reverse side of his desire to love and to be loved in return. The tragedy of Frankenstein is a premonition of the dangers that science, like eugenics and biomedical engineering, will not be used for the humane purposes of the relief of the human estate, but rather to create a kind of new superior master race. Since the time of Shelley, the idea of a post-human future with genetically modified features has come to appear not simply as the fodder for science fiction, but as an imminent reality. In her new study, Mary Shelley and the Rights of the Child, Eileen Botting Hunt, has usefully pointed to the relation of Shelley to the possibilities of what is called transhumanism or posthumanism. And nowhere has this phenomenon been more clearly expressed, I believe, than in Michel Houellebecq's novel, The Elementary Particles. For those unfamiliar with the book, it is a story of two half-brothers, Bruno Clement and Michel Brzezinski, who have come to adulthood in post-1960s France, a world of secularism, materialism, and the breakdown of the family. Bruno will grow up to become a hopeless sex addict, whose life consists of one failed sexual escapade after another, while Michel, lonely and misanthropic, becomes a world-famous scientist whose work leads to a world historical discovery that will eventually bring about a new post-human species. Like Shelley's Victor Frankenstein, Michel's early life is colored by his attraction to science. At the age of 10, he reads a magazine called The Universe Explained that introduces him to the wonders of nature. Yet rather than inducing a sense of awe and beauty, he is appalled by its cruelty and brutality. At university at Oates, Michel falls under the influence of a brilliant scientist named Desplechin, who plays the same role in Michel's life that Waldman does for Victor. Desplechin arranges for Michel to become a researcher in his lab at the Institute for Molecular Biology in Palaiseau, just outside Paris. And it is here that we learn Michel will write his most important paper toward a science of perfect reproduction that we find out later is a plan to separate entirely sex from reproduction. Desplechin later secures Michel a position at the Galway Centre for Genetic Research on the western coast of Ireland. And it is during this time that he begins to work on a series of notebooks, the full import of which will not become apparent until many years after his mysterious disappearance. These notebooks contain the basic ideas for the creation of a replacement species that will put an end once and for all to those uniquely human illusions of vanity, egoism, and individuality. While such ideas were initially met with scorn and condemnation, Houellebecq writes that they eventually came to be accepted and even received generous UNESCO funding. In Michel's honor, the prototype of the new species is created in his old laboratory in Palaiseau 20 years after his reported disappearance. His colleagues would celebrate the occasion that for the first time in human history, one species had created the condition for its own replacement. What Shelley saw only as a dim premonition of the frightening prospects brought about in Victor's come to light fully in Victor's laboratory with its vision of a fully post-human future. The image is of a race of happy, contented, and satisfied beings no longer tormented by the old Adam of sexual jealousy, frustration, and desire. Men consider us to be happy, Houellebecq writes of this new race, and I continue. It is certainly true that we have succeeded in overcoming the forces of egotism, cruelty, and anger which they could not. We live different lives. Science and art are still part of our society, but without the stimulus of personal vanity, the pursuit of truth and beauty has taken on less urgent aspect. To humans of the old species, our world seems a paradise. We have even been known to refer to ourselves with a certain humor by the name they so long ago dreamed of, gods. One might call this Houellebecq's image of the end of history. This paper got all wet, sticking to me.
Yeah.
Good. I'm coming to the conclusion here. Rousseau, Shelley, and Houellebecq all see the dangers of the Enlightenment project understood as the scientific control of nature, ostensibly for the achievement of progress and the augmentation of human happiness. Frankenstein's creature has become Exhibit A in the way this project has gone wrong. Rousseau was the first of the moderns to underscore this tension between the progress of science and the needs of morality. He condemned what he called the base and deceptive uniformity that coincided with a culture of material progress. A scientific civilization can produce a host of conveniences that make life longer, comfortable, and more prosperous, but it cannot provide a defense against the decay of spirit, taste, and mind, to say nothing of the ever-increasing invasion of privacy that it fosters. Yet Rousseau also regarded the great scientist philosophers of his era as creative geniuses who need to be sheltered from society. Shelley develops many of these arguments in her treatment of Victor Frankenstein as the modern Prometheus, so named after the Greek hero who had stolen fire from the gods and thereby enabled the creation of civilization. But while Prometheus has always been a hero to advocates of progress and rebellion, Shelley draws another lesson. Victor, we learn, becomes a chastened Prometheus, one who lives to regret his efforts to transcend the limits of humanity by creating a new race. His mature wisdom consists in the discovery that scientific knowledge, emancipated from moral and political restraints, leads to the disaster and the destruction of humanity. And it is this aspiration to become greater than nature will allow that is the premise of Houellebecq's Elementary Particles. Michel Drzynski is not a romantic creator like Victor. His interest in molecular biology stems less from utopian idealism than from a hatred of humanity for its collective cruelty and stupidity. He is a misanthrope through and through. The narrator refers gleefully to the ridicule into which the works of Foucault, Lacan, Derrida, and Deleuze will fall after decades of what he calls inane reverence. Yet Houellebecq's claim that Michel inaugurated a grand metaphysical mutation that had projected history forward, into a post-human future is precisely the view of historical change that Michel Foucault had proposed half a century ago. As the archaeology of our thoughts easily shows, Foucault wrote at the end of Les Mots et les Choses, man is an invention of recent date, and one perhaps nearing its end. On this view, Houellebecq seems perfectly in place with the thought of post-1968 France. So beginning with Rousseau, moving to Shelley, and concluding with Houellebecq, we have now come, as it were, full circle. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll keep the cue, and I'm happy to adjudicate the discussion. Questions? Please.
Very, very stimulating papers. Thank you for that. I've a very quick question for David Archard. I thought your discussion of the happiness principle was fascinating. Another thing which came to my mind that perhaps is another threat to the creature's happiness is his education, through the education, through reading Milton and Goethe, he becomes self-aware, and that perhaps adds to his depression, to his sense of monstrosity. This is something that comes across, of course, in other 19th century texts, later 19th century texts. I'm thinking of Pygmalion by Shaw, for example. Do you think that could be something for consideration?
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is the account that's given of how you acquire morality. And certainly, is monster or creature? Which term do we want to?
Creature.
We prefer creature. Monster serve my purposes for obvious reasons. But the creature acquires a sense of morality both from reading the texts he has access to, which are historical and moral, as well as his emotions. And there's a familiar division in the history of moral theory as to how we acquire morality, whether it's through principally the emotions of sympathy, compassion, and reciprocal benevolence, or through the exercise of reason. So I think it is interesting that his struggle with what is required of him to be moral, because he gets it right. Gets it absolutely right. His problem is that when he exercises what he's come to see as the proper traits of benevolence and compassion, he's simply rejected. And again, just check the text. He's rebutted at 2 points. One on the rescuing of the girl, and he's attacked and chased off. And he says something like his rage could not express itself against humans because of what he'd learnt. So he takes it out on inanimate objects. His killing of William is the second time he's attacked as a result of Felix's attack on him for trying to help the father. And then he says, well, there's a perfect object for my rage, namely my creator. So he moves, interestingly, from an acceptance that however he feels, you can't be immoral towards human beings, to I can be immoral properly towards one human being, my creator. And the emotion there is one of revenge. And it almost actually, you might say, just revenge. It's appropriate for him to. So I think the answer to your question is a very subtle and sophisticated account of how we learn ab initio, from the beginning, to be moral, by a mixture of the reading of texts, which are carefully chosen in the novel, and by witnessing the behavior of others. Again, if I get it right, what the creature sees and doesn't quite understand is why are people sad, why are people happy when he's in the cottage. And he understands what it means to love, to be benevolent, to be caring, to be forgiving. And that's a very, very standard, what's called a non-cognitivist account of morality in terms of emotions, rather than in terms of knowledge. So it's a beautiful combination of the two.
Do we want to mic for the speakers?
Sure.
Can you hear at the back? Okay.
Yeah, we'll pass a mic here.
Okay.
Going forward.
Thank you.
We'll also have a
Thank
mic
you.
for the
Yeah.
audience. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, please.
I just have a follow-up question.
Please
about-
introduce yourself before you ask the question.
Evan Kirksey, and
Yeah.
disciplinary background is anthropology. I also have a question about happiness, and more of an etymological one. So Sarah Ahmed, a feminist critic, wrote a book recently called The Promise of Happiness, and she insists that we return to an early modern idea of happiness that is all about chance and contingency and hap. So I'm just wondering how to situate this particular text within the etymology of happiness.
Well, that's too big a question. It's standard now, at least in moral theory, to contrast a rather modern notion of happiness as subjective states of well-being from an earlier classical Greek conception, Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia, which is actually a sort of notion of flourishing. And Aristotle is quite interesting as to whether eudaimonia is a result of choice or simple luck, serendipity and circumstance. So we may have fortunate and blessed lives through nothing we've done. So in that sense, I think you're right. And in that our life goes well, maybe not down to us, but the accidents of birth.
But it seems like the monster has no chance.
Creature.
The creature has no chance of hap in that social sense because of his visage. There's no possibility of the happy encounter.
Yeah. Yes, not unless others change. I mean, he's a victim of both his creator and the reactions of others. Though, again, I'm talking, what sequence? When he first sees himself in reflection, he's horrified. There's no explanation of why he should be horrified, except he's presumably comparing his own reflection with those of others. But it's the association of his awful appearance with the behavior of others to him that's the crucial point of transformation. Why should I be hated for how I look when I've done nothing?
Yes, you. Thanks for speaking.
Thank you.
I'm Jim Chandler. Is that on? Yes. I'm Jim Chandler from the University of Chicago. My question draws on the first two talks, but it's really addressed to the third speaker, Stephen Smith. So both of the first two speakers emphasized the sort of balance between the monstrous side of the question and the Frankenstein as playing with God's side of the question. It occurs to me that there might be matter in Rousseau to support the monstrous side of the story as well. So I liked that you emphasized the bit in the first discourse about science creating monsters. But Rousseau himself in the Reveries, I think it's actually in one of the passages you quoted, but you didn't go that far. He says, here I am, the most sociable of human beings, but I'm everywhere regarded as a monster. Partout regardé comme un monstre. Monstre is the French word. So that's the monstrous side of the story, and it gives you that second side. You know, the crux of the matter is whether monsters are made or perceived in a way. And that's the side, also in Rousseau, that suggests that monstrosity is perceived. And that seems to complicate the relation of Shelley to Rousseau a little bit. Would you agree?
Thanks, is this on? Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I didn't get into the full version of the paper actually does take up the creatures part of the story too, just for purposes of I thought it worked better with the argument I was making to concentrate this morning on what I call the education of Victor. But certainly the creature is in many ways, this is the way I look at the kind of creature-monster problem. He's creaturely, yes, but he's in a way turned into a monster by society, by the way people see him. And that is a sort of, that is that Rousseauvian theme, you know, man is born good, but we are corrupted by society and by the opinion, through the opinions that other people have of us. And this whole domain of what Rousseau calls amour propre becomes so psychologically powerful in this transition from how we are sort of innocent and good. The creature, remember, is originally vegetarian and so on, and yet is turned into something monstrous by the way he's perceived by those around him. So I think that would follow that as the way in which, if I had had more time, that plays into that problem.
It's the story of the Confessions, really.
Very much so. Well, it's this story that runs throughout all of Rousseau's work, both at the individual autobiographical level of the way he sees himself, and at what you might call the kind of historical level of the way he sees how the human species has evolved and changed from one of natural goodness or innocence to evil.
Thank you.
Okay, please. Right here in this third row.
Thank you. Mary Jacobus, Cambridge. Hello. Thank you. Mary Jacobus at Cambridge. This is a question for Stephen Smith. I very much enjoyed all the papers, but Stephen Smith's paper touched on something I'm interested in, and I was struck by the quote from, I think I'm right, it was from Houellebecq, the inane reverence to Derrida,
Yes,
what strikes me about all of the Rousseau and Frankenstein and Derrida, etc., is that they're all dealing with a problem within Enlightenment, which is that Enlightenment actually it breaks down at certain points, so it doesn't, it's not like our contemporary aghastness about the breakdown of what we thought was liberal democracy. We suddenly seem to be in a world of post-liberal democracy. And I think what's curious about the Enlightenment is that it's always already under enormous stress. And I think you brought that out, and I'm not sure, I haven't read the Houellebecq novel, whether he is being somewhat ironic about the French, the French philosophers who were themselves obsessed with that very question, it seems to me, about the impossibility of certain inbuilt claims or potentialities within the Enlightenment itself. I wonder if you just sort of elaborate on that, because I think what is extraordinary about Frankenstein is how, although it's lodged in a kind of Rousseauian Godwinian, etc., situation, it is also looking at the breakdown of those positions for the human. Does that make sense?
I completely agree with what you said about that. I think Rousseau, Shelley, Houellebecq are all in different ways, and I hope I haven't, someone kind of mushed them together, but they all do seem to me in different ways to be responding to this sort of Enlightenment belief that science and the kind of modern scientific project that Victor learns about once he starts attending university, that this scientific project that began with a kind of promise to create, to make life longer, better, more prosperous, and of course we've all been in obvious ways benefited from that, had another side to it as well. That Rousseau, I think, initially explored, that Shelley takes up and explores further, and that, of course there's so many modern novels and books of philosophy that explore what you might call the dark side, underside of science, that I needn't even go into them, but I sort of almost fortuitously was reading the Houellebecq novel at around the time when Eileen asked me to join this panel, and I thought this is an extraordinary sequel, in a way, to Frankenstein. Houellebecq makes no mention of Mary Shelley, and obviously he knows the book, but he doesn't figure in his narrative. But the account of Michel Drzezinski in the book seems in many ways so much like Victor, but now armed with much greater, powerful scientific laboratories and techniques, that it seems almost a kind of, again, a post-human sequel to it. But, I mean, it's hard to say, to get back to one of your points, to what degree Michel, the character in Elementary Particles, the biologist, in which way that person speaks for, or in any ways represents Michel Houellebecq, the author of the book. I mean, Houellebecq is such a kind of dystopian misanthrope that, in a way, you want to think that's his perspective, but it's hard to know, really. But I was intrigued, by the way, that this extraordinary novel of ideas, and it is very much Houellebecq's book, in a way, it's a kind of counterpart, and I thought it helped to bring, beginning with Rousseau and then taking Shelley into a kind of full circle.
Sam?
This is a question for Joyce, but coming from a point that Dave made about the distinction between guilt and shame, that made me think of one of your fictional characters, that's Jinx Fairchild, from a novel, I think, in the early 90s. And the desire of Jinx in the novel, and maybe Victor to confess. In Victor, he confesses to Walton in a novel. Jinx confesses his crime to his father. And I'm wondering if you think that there's a desire among individuals in your book and in Frankenstein to confess their sins, to somehow convert the guilt, which is something that they experience individually, into shame, which as Dave said, is something that you experience more broadly in response to society, and whether that maybe is less burdensome than guilt is individually.
Well, it's something like an ingenious comparison I wouldn't have thought of myself. I'm not sure that I understand the question.
I'm just asking about the conversion between guilt and shame. So maybe Victor Frankenstein's conversion is by confessing in the same way that the creatures is, and then Jinx Fairchild is continually throughout the novel wants to confess, feels guilty, and eventually does to his father. And whether that's present in religion too, the element of confessing your sins, somehow converting the guilt into shame by people knowing about it.
It's an interesting idea. I haven't really given it much thought. Obviously shame is something that we feel being perceived by other people. Guilt is something that's maybe more sophisticated, that's something that's within. I think of Mary Shelley's novel as just this extraordinary aesthetic accomplishment, but it is a fantasy, and in some way she's making things up, and she's putting things together from many things she's read. And it's an ingenious creation for a first novel by anyone of any age, but let alone 18 or 19, it's just sort of amazing. So I was sort of approaching my paper from that point of view of the aesthetic phenomenon of the novel. I haven't given a thought do that, but that's very interesting, obviously. And I was thinking, listening to these very interesting papers, that the philosophical repercussions of the novel are just so manifold, and so much there. But I was looking upon it also as a somewhat, now stereotypical is the wrong word, because at the time Mary Shelley was writing this, there wasn't the stereotype, but it's this vision of the scientist who, no matter what he does, because he has that role in the tragedy, no matter what he does, it's going to be a sort of a guilty or shameful act. There's no way that he can not be a kind of Dr. Moreau in H.G. Wells's allegory of the island of Dr. Moreau. It seems, as with Swift's vision of the fantastically funny scientists in the island of Laputa, that anything that they do is ludicrous and laughable. There isn't the position, well, let's be neutral about the scientists, is what Dr. Frankenstein actually was trying to do in itself from a scientific perspective is perfectly natural. He's pushing the science of his time a little farther. If he had succeeded, it wouldn't have been that difficult maybe for him to have not made his creation go into exile. I mean, that's the mistake that he makes, is in the first glance he repudiates his work. A real scientist would not have done that. So the portrait of this man as a scientist is sort of a romantic vision of a scientist contaminated by just the fact that he's a scientist. But from a scientific point of view, it's not clear that he did anything that wrong. Those people just not agree with that.
Great.
Yeah, please.
I just want to make a quick point about the areas of science. And,
Oh, wait, just a second, yeah, please, yeah.
I just think there's an important distinction between the belief that it's wrong in itself for science to pursue certain kinds of projects, such as the transformation of the human or the mastery of nature, and a quite distinct view that that's okay, but what you risk is it getting it wrong in terms of outcomes and distorted models of science. So I'm actually not a Panglossian, but I'm quite a big Enlightenment optimist about nature, about science. I just think you have to go on very carefully about its misuse. Don't as such object to the Enlightenment project.
Very good. Yeah, Julie, yeah.
Sorry.
I wanted to say I appreciated the allusions to Swift, and I don't know if you know that Gulliver's Travels was one of the texts that Mary Shelley was reading while she was writing the first draft. But my question is for all of the speakers, or for anyone, because it's all of the connections between thinking about guilt and shame, physical appearance, and responsibility. Made me think a lot about one of the reasons that Frankenstein's so relevant in the moment, and one of the things my students tend to respond to is the kind of allegory for race in the novel, and the creatures potentially thinking about the creature's experience as an embodied experience of otherness because of physical difference, which speaks to a lot of conversations that we're having in this moment. And I thought especially of a book, a little book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. I don't know if anyone has read this book, which really reads race in this way as the experience of being in a black body, which is read always by others as dangerous. And so which creates the opportunity to seize and destroy that black body at will, which is the experience of living in a black body in America, he makes the argument. And so I just thought so much of what you're talking about right now speaks to why we love this novel, because it continues to be so relevant to really important conversations in the moment. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about any of the panelists on these kinds of questions about embodied experience and race and ethnicity.
would like to take it first? David?
I just wanted to make one quick comment, which is, again, rereading it, what's so interesting is that the creature can reveal himself to De Lacy in the cottage because he's blind.
Yeah.
So he's identified only by his voice, which he's mastered language, and he's picked up as not speaking entirely properly. But it's the perception, visual perception of him, that causes the problems. And that seems to me quite interesting to your point about how otherness is embodied, and it has to be seen and touched in order to be perceived as problematic. Just then, quick point, since I live on Ireland, I live in Ireland, Irishness is not worn on the skin. But what's interesting is how far discrimination against the Irish led to very crude physiognomic caricatures of the Irish, who otherwise would only be identified by their voice and accent. So there almost need to see the other in physical terms before you can be prejudiced. Voice alone won't do it.
Either of you like to respond?
Well, that was wonderful, I think, the analog with Coates' little book. But he's basically talking about being black in America, and I'm not sure that it translates generally, but being black in America, to be in this physical body, to be always perceived by the majority, the white majority, as being so other. And I noticed in reading the novel that Mary Shelley uses some of the same adjectives again and again and again, like horrid, horrible, loathsome. It's almost like a Monty Python sort of thing. It's so over-determined. It's certainly not nuanced at all. And you certainly get the feeling that she is growing, as she's writing, she's growing ever more embodied in the monster, in the creature himself, so that as the novel proceeds, she's ever more becoming him, he's becoming her, and she's completely immersed in this so-called monstrous imagination. There's no doubt of her allegiance with the creature at the end.
I must admit, I'd never thought about it in terms of issues of race and race consciousness, which I'm sure is going to come up. To me, the moral problem at the core of the book is, in a way, the problem of power and responsibility. Victor clearly has the power conferred by science and our ability to, in this case, animate life, reanimate life. He has tremendous power, and yet what he lacks is any real sense of responsibility as to how to use that power. He, has this Promethean aspiration. He wants to be a god. He wants to be adored. He wants to be worshipped. He wants to be like the god to the new Adam. And yet, at the end, he comes to see that this is a great mistake. It's been a tremendous mistake on his part. What exactly the conclusion of this will be is not altogether clear. As the creature, who is, in my view, now become a monster, is kind of free and let loose, and you don't really know what's going to happen at the end. But it does seem to me that it's this issue. To me, it is the terms of power and responsibility that are at the, many ways, the more, less to me. I didn't think of it in terms of guilt and shame, but power and responsibility seemed to me the important moral concepts that the book explores.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I have a number of hands, so I want to write down a few. Yeah, we'll start with Gudrun. Your name behind Gudrun? What's your name? Stuart. Yeah, Stuart will be next. And I'll write down your names here. Yeah, in the queue.
I'm Gudrun Grabner from the University of Innsbruck, Austria. I appreciated all of the three presentations very much. Thank you. A comment on David's paper. I was thinking that in the early 19th century, this superstitious notion and belief in maternal impression was still very much alive. So this idea that if a mother gave birth to a deformed child, that it was her fault, so to speak, because of her indulging in certain kinds of food or even indulging in certain kinds of feedings. If we transfer this to Frankenstein, then we could speak of paternal impression, and then the creature the monster would revert back, the one who created it, and just like with maternal impression, cause feelings of guilt and shame. Can you say anything on that or comment on that? Would that fit into your philosophical notions on happiness, shame, and guilt?
As Eileen knows, I think the most interesting aspect of the novel is it's an essay in procreative responsibility. I mean, it's about the duties of the creator towards whatever is created, and Victor clearly fails. But I mean, behind that lies an interesting question of how much responsibility the procreator can have for the characteristics of the procreated. There are lots of prejudicial views about why those who are created turn out in certain kinds of ways. To repeat, I think the most interesting thing about Frankenstein is it's a tabula rasa view of the creature. I mean, he is open to everything and actually is disposed to be good with all the good character traits. He's molded into a bad monster by circumstances and social reaction. That's him. I'm not a genetic determinist. And since genome editing is going to come up throughout this, I should just quickly say I'm leaving early because my other hat is to be the chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which is the UK's National Ethics Committee, and we're producing a major report on gene editing next week, which I have to go back and defend to the media. If it takes soccer off the front page, that'll be very good. So I'm not a genetic determinist, but it crucially influences a lot of people now. There are different models of why offspring or children end up the way we do, and we're in the grip of a genetic paradigm at the moment, which it seems to me is false.
Okay, great. Stuart Caron.
Stuart Caron, University of Pennsylvania. The question I have is stems from what it seems to be in the novel is a wholesale critique of the conjunction of aesthetics and ethics, as you were talking about. And that critique actually, in some sense or another, goes back to her father. In political justice, the agency for change is rhetoric. And one of the astonishing things about the writing of this novel is that she manages different rhetorics, or different registers of eloquence, so that the creature comes off at the top. And the only people that he deals with, or deal with him on a social level, are the blind DeLacy,
yes,
and Walton, who I shut my eyes involuntarily and called upon him to stay. He looked at me in wonderment. The first time in his entire existence that anybody asked him to be part of the human discipline. So the question here is there not somewhere in the history of philosophy something of the same thing going on, where you substitute sound for sight, rhetoric for aesthetics, and you get a different level of engagement? But I don't know, I just wonder.
Pass. that does seem to be a brilliant thought, and the registers of identity and reciprocity across the senses is really interesting, and it can't be coincidental that the creature succeeds in speech and fails in appearance. That has to be a certain kind of critique of how we react to people and how we interact with them.
Let's see, I think we have time for just a couple more questions, but I want to, why don't we take the questions very quickly and then we'll have the panel respond. So keep your questions brief. Elizabeth Young, Anne Malore, and Brad Gregory.
Elizabeth Young, Mount Holyoke College. Thanks to the panelists for a really stimulating panel. Okay, quickly, sort of picking up on some of the threads of gender in the panel and also starting to think about the afterlives of Frankenstein, which two of the panelists brought up. So first, for Joyce Carol Oates, I was really intrigued that you picked The Yellow Wallpaper as your afterlife text, and you were, I think, building an argument about it as a kind of feminist successor, or as a feminist successor to Frankenstein that picks up on some of the feminist themes in Frankenstein, and focusing particularly on women and monstrous imagination in the Gilman story. It strikes me that there are other ways to read that story as well. The monstrous imagination might be that of the male scientist, the doctor and the husband, who kind of turn the narrator into a form of monster. But just to think, if you could expand on thinking about the kind of gendered legacies of Shelley in the Gilman story. And then maybe just quickly, in the third paper, I'm curious about Houellebecq. I'm just going to take off the table that he is offering a kind of feminist successor to Shelley, given his...
I think that's fair enough.
Yes, but I did wonder if anything in Elementary Particles picks up on the sort of turbulence of masculinity in Shelley's Frankenstein, if there is not as a feminist critique, but what kind of portrait of misguided or monstrous masculinity might be in that novel. Again, I haven't read it, so just sort of speculating, but perhaps.
Can we take the 3 questions in turn, and then we'll have the responses from the panel? And more first, yeah, in front of you.
I'll be very quick. This is to go back to the relationship between the aesthetic and the moral. And a book that I think Mary Shelley read and was very critical in her thinking is a novel by Anne Plumtree called Something New. And the something new was to have a female heroine who was ugly. So the argument of that novel was the emergence of a concept of what nowadays we would call inner beauty. Which is very important, I think, to any discussion of disability studies these days, that we have to see past the outward appearance to the inner virtue, etc. So disconnecting the appearance and moral reality, which, of course, she's then critiquing Lavater's essays on physiognomy. She's critiquing Spurzheim, anyone who made a necessary connection between the inner and the outer, which, of course, comes up in the novel in that mirror when the creature first sees himself in the pool, and he says, originally I thought I was good, but now that I see what others see, they see me as monstrous. But I don't think it's a tabula rasa argument. I think it's more subtle than that he has an inner self that no one can see.
And Brad Gregory.
Hi, Brad Gregory, the director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. I'm also a historian. I want to pick up on the same theme that's been a part of a lot of questions and was threaded through all 3 presentations, but particularly David Archard's on the relationship between the aesthetic and the ethical. Let's imagine if this is a kind of counterfactual experiment, that Mary Shelley's creativity had taken a different turn, and that instead of Victor Frankenstein, in a certain sense, rushing passionately to create the monster ASAP, he'd taken a bit more time to master it. And so that the monster didn't look like he ended up looking, but in fact looked like Adonis. Looked like Adonis. Absolutely beautiful, incredibly wonderful, and therefore the reaction, presumably, of all the other protagonists and people in the novel, it would have been in fact a totally different novel, and the relationship between power and responsibility vis-a-vis the Enlightenment, the use of science, the misuse of science, would presumably have been radically different. But nothing would have been different in terms of Victor Frankenstein having created not a hideous and therefore, as it were, star-crossed creation, but in fact one that was absolutely beautiful and an exemplar of humanity, and Victor Frankenstein and Elizabeth get married and everything. So anyway, it's a counterfactual supposition. Yes. It doesn't change the createdness of the creature, but the appearance makes the point, it seems to me, that many of you are making.
Panelists may respond. We just have a few minutes and then we're going to move on to coffee. But I'd like to give you, the 3 of you, a chance to respond to those questions.
What was I supposed to respond to? Did you want me to respond to the question about the yellow wallpaper? Yeah, well, that was so interesting because if you look at it from the point of view of the woman writer who's in a world of surrounded by men, and she's always basically at the mercy of her physical being. Poor Mary Shelley, at her young age, already pregnant a couple of times and having lost a baby. It's just astonishing to think that one could create it under these circumstances. So the woman in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's story, that woman has just had a baby also, and there's quite a bit about the baby. I've read the story a number of times. There's more about the baby in the story than one thinks. But she's so anxious when the baby's put in her arms. She becomes very nervous. She says, I want to be with the baby, but he makes me so nervous, so better take him away. It's as if maybe she might do something to that baby, so it's better the baby's away. So she's forced to be in this bed. She's sort of like a large infant herself. With nothing to stimulate her imagination, she becomes obsessed with the wallpaper. What appears to be a female figure inside the wallpaper, by day subdued and quiet, hidden behind ugly yellow design, but trying to free herself as from its straitjacket. Then this is Skillman. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind the wallpaper, and sometimes only one. And she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. In the very shady spots, she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. It's a wonderful image of the awakening of the self in the narrator and in all women, coming to consciousness of the imprisonment in this world. And at the end, she, as I said before, she sort of conjoins with that figure in the narrator and the figure in the wallpaper, and maybe the author and then the female reader, and it's the husband, the doctor who faints. And so we have to creep over him. For our freedom, we're creeping over him every time. So though there are not very many women or significant women in Frankenstein the novel, yet that consciousness seems to be from a female perspective.
So just quickly, I really liked your question and the link to disability studies. And so there are important questions about the disadvantage that might be suffered simply in virtue of certain physical features, and those disadvantages that are socially constructed as a result of the way in which others view it. And the counterfactual question, would Victor have done wrong in creating a perfect human being, seems to me interesting in as much as I'm not sure I see anything wrong per se with creating human life. There is something wrong in creating human life without discharging the subsequent responsibilities you have to those you create. So I was involved for a number of years as a member of the UK's Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, which regulates fertility treatment in the UK. And one of the most extraordinary things to do is to visit a fertility clinic and see the barrel in which is held, thousands of gametes. And if you talk to the fertility clinicians, they sound remarkably like Victor in some respects. Here is life, or here is the prospect of life. But that is seen as actually extraordinarily good, because you're providing children to those who otherwise would not be able to have them. So Victor goes wrong, it seems to me, not in creating life, but in creating life and then failing subsequently to honour the responsibilities he has towards that being that he's created.
The last word.
Very quickly, on misguided masculinity. I think Houellebecq's book is full of this. I mean, the two characters, one a completely lonely, misanthropic kind of genius. The other brother, half-brother, who I didn't really talk about, but who occupies probably more of the book than Michel, is a sex addict who's, his sex addiction is a large part of what the book is about. These seem to be the two models of masculinity that are put forward. And in many ways you can read Houellebecq as offering a very conservative reading of this. Why? Because this is the response of the fact of the kind of post-60s breakdown of the family. Both children have been abandoned by their mother. Also kind of a Rousseauian theme. He abandons his children. The two boys are abandoned by their mother, who's kind of a hippie and goes off to California and so on and so on. Esselin, and she's involved in all these kind of 60s style experimentations and living. So it's very full of misguidedness. I'd also like to end just on one, thinking about David when he talked about this kind of Platonic conjunction of truth, beauty, and virtue, and bring it back to a theme that's been raised. Plato makes a great point of the fact that Socrates is very ugly. The purveyor of the great wisdom and the beauties of truth is presented by someone who's physically very repulsive. And it seems to me that if you want to call it monstrous or whatever theme, is brought into the history of philosophy. Maybe it's not its central problem, but it's brought in there right at the beginning. So I just mentioned that en passant.
And he was up.
No.
When he was.
Well, Mary and Percy certainly knew their Plato. And I love the idea of the creature as a kind of Socratic figure. So let's give our panelists a warm round of applause.